Hello, everybody. This is Trip, and I am here in Edinburgh, Scotland. My Zoom background is a hobbit hole. This is not what all homes look like in Scotland. I am here with my friend, Dr. Adam Clark, and this is the kickoff session for our Black Theology reading group. How are you doing, Adam?
I'm doing well. If I knew you had the Hobbit hole, I would have put a picture of Wakanda in the background, right? That kind of would have matched.
Yeah, that was that's what Reggie Williams was rocking during
That's
the
right.
during
That's
his
right.
visit to Bonhoeffer. That would have tempted me to have an excursus, on comic books. Um,
Well,
so,
we're going to talk about, we could talk about that. Afrofuturism is part of Black theology, so we could talk about that.
oh, I know that's a good idea. We should
Yeah,
do that. Not right today,
right,
not
right,
today,
right.
because I have an outline. I want to make sure we get it through everything. But what we're going to do first is we'll introduce ourselves, talk about the class, the format and stuff like that, and then we'll be introducing the big four themes that center the reading, reflection, and hopefully that will generate some interest. And some of you were, y'all have done, a number of you've done homebrewed reading groups before, so you sent in questions in anticipation of the first session. Imagine you've seen Adam on the podcast before and thought, hey, if I send in questions before the first session, not everyone will have thought to do this. They're bound to get to mine, which is a sneaky move, a high quality move, everyone that did so. So, preferential option for the eager questioners.
For the curious.
Yeah, for the curious. So, so Adam, maybe you want to say a bit about um, uh, here's a way of getting at it. So tell us about your own religious experience growing up and when both the questions you had of faith demanded the rigorous academic work you've done and connected to the particular vibrant voice of James Cohen as your academic mentor.
Wow. Okay. I actually grew up an Episcopalian.
Mm-hmm.
I was an acolyte for a number of years. So it's kind of funny when I told my parents that we're going to be talking to Bishop Curry, that was like talking to Pope Francis for them. I mean, they were so excited. Forget that I got a PhD with James Cohen. It's like Curry. I mean, you can't beat that. But in terms of my own religious questions, I had kind of general Sunday school questions until I got to college, and I had some mentors who were in the religion department and at the time, liberation theology was very much the current trend of the day. And I started seeing a more humanized version of Jesus and a more humanized idea of the gospel. We started reading stuff like, I remember in Bible school, well, in our church group, we would read like the Cotton Patch Bible with Clarence Jordan. I got introduced to historical criticism, and I started to see that I don't have to leave my mind at the door in order to be a person of faith. And that was very compelling to me. And I was kind of angry that I did not get that in church, that the church that I went to and attended, and I started becoming a Baptist also at this time too, because my academic mentors were Baptists. But probably the number one question was always a question of justice and liberation for me. I was always pursuing how do we use faith to promote justice? And liberation theology was landed and at the right developmental time for me to actually take off with that.
Mm-hmm. And I think that a lot of a lot of people that are born into faith communities and families that practice, there's a number of different questions that ring hard first, right? And some of them it leads to leaving the faith behind or making a deep faith transition and things. When is there a way you would describe those kind of first initial questions that sunk in deep enough that you ended up a theologian?
Wow. Yeah, that's a good question. What was the it's different. My story is different from many home view viewers, because the typical thing that I hear from home view viewers is that they grow up in a very, very conservative evangelical tradition and something breaks for them. Well, I grew up in a liberal tradition, so it wasn't as suffocating. Although I flirted with evangelicalism, it wasn't as suffocating for me. It was more of a question of relevance. How can I make this gospel relevant to people I care about? How can I make this relevant to the person down the street who's hurting and oppressed? And I didn't see the church doing that effectively. So the way James Cohen would put it, he talks about it in terms of, in the Gospel of Matthew, the Pharisees go to Jesus and says, well, what's the greatest commandment? And he says, loving God with your whole heart, whole soul, and whole mind, right? And the church does a really good job at loving God with their heart and their soul. But loving God with your mind is something that the church undervalues. And theology is probably best understood as loving God with your mind. Or as Gustavo Gutierrez talks about it, it's a love letter to God. And that's where I pursued my passion with.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really important, and it's definitely something that that scholars have in common. Christian or people of faith scholars across disciplines, right? Like I have friends that are literature professors and scientists that have a similar thing, that that part of loving God as an intellectual and someone that's curious is that ongoing critical reflection.
Yeah,
in in thinking of the way you used even the phrase the question of relevance, right? That's when a mainliner talks about relevance, so often it is about like justice or work in your community or how you're invested. When evangelicals use relevance, it usually means they're doing a poor cover band of a secular band that's popular with Jesus boyfriend lyrics in it. So like there's another contrast you can use next time. When I say relevant, I'm talking about the material lived reality of people on the underside of our community,
okay,
not 90s pop punk with
right.
Jesus as a referent.
Right. Well, I grew up in hip hop culture, so for me, relevance was more about, and I also grew up at the tail end of kind of the anti-apartheid movement, also as well. And at the time, you had, Jesse Jackson as the first Black making a major run for president. You had Louis Farrakhan on the scene, that type of thing. So there's a lot of political activity at that moment. And really, to me, it was more about how to be relevant was identical to social justice. Social justice was always the question, and how to actually animate this within Black communities. And also at the time when you're in your young 20s, you want to make it cool. It's got to be creative. It's got to be playful. And I was around people who, it seems like liberationists, at least the ones that I met, made it cool, made it relevant. So you could actually talk about issues of character and issues of social transformation at the same time, instead of it being just a gospel of piety, or what I call a religion of the don'ts. Don't drink, don't smoke, don't have sex before marriage, that type of thing, which is what I kind of grew up with, that kind of popular doctrine.
Yeah. So for those that are new to homebrewed Christianity stuff because of the reading group and don't know me, I'll say a little bit. You can ask any follow-up question you want, Adam. One question. I don't want to start spilling my soul. There's thousands of episodes where I say random things about myself. But in particular, this the origin story for wanting to do this outside of just our friendship is I moved to California 11 or 12 years ago to do my PhD at Claremont in philosophy of religion and theology. And I grew up in the South, Baptist preacher's kid. We were church planners and was in art magnet schools. So I was in a much more diverse and progressive environment than a lot of Southerners in the theater program, which, is another layer of that. And so when my parents were involved in the 90s in a lot of the racial reconciliation movement among Southern evangelicals and things. So it wasn't until I was doing the anti-racism training for ordination in the Disciples of Christ that I realized what some of the things you've talked about before, like the precognitive power of racism, how to being born in a culture, there's more at work than just, like thinking different thoughts, right? And those came to the fore. And when I moved to California and worked at a very progressive and diverse UCC congregation there, I didn't think much about it until I moved back to the South for a year and a half before I came to Scotland. And my oldest son had grown up in California, and then he moved to the South. He wasn't a Southerner like his parents. And his observations about Southern religious life, even the ones I would have said were the more progressive ones, and the latent supremacy culture in it and stuff, really made me like start wrestling and looking into my own history as a family and researching that and thinking about it again. And so because of that and bringing up that exploration on the podcast for the last couple of years, more and more people have said, I've also been processing different things, or people come to move back to the South, like Robin Henderson Espinoza moved back to the South. And we did a class on theologies of resistance and spent time talking about race and being Southerners from the South and such. And so those conversations were in the air. And then all of a sudden, my friends and clergies that are connected to me who thought I was overstating things and exaggerating things, were like, well, maybe you weren't. Right. And I after gifting James Cohen Crossing the Lynching Tree 6 or 7 times in the first month, the first month of all the questions raising, that I just, as you and I were talking, I was like, hey, what if we did an online reading room where you could get people that have been wrestling with these texts for a long time in communities that have been formed by them, those that are new to it, those that are like going to ghost in the community, not say anything, ever engage, but get to overhear it. And we can create a space online for people to not just like think about the questions, but to read and wrestle with some of the major thinkers and get guided through the text by really cool guide yourself and visits from some amazing scholars. So that's kind of like the personal background to getting to this class. And I'm super excited. There's over 1,600 people that have signed up.
Yeah, I'm very excited about that. I'm impressed. And when you say that, it absolutely helps me clarify what drove me. Probably if I had to identify one theological issue, it was the question of salvation. I was confused at how, in mostly atonement, how that was enough, how you could kind of just say a confession and that you could do the confession of faith, your soul goes to God, and then you live as if you're going to heaven. And I said, that seems to be there was something that never sat right with me, if that is the sum total of faith, right? That it's about your soul and not about your whole, your personhood, right? And to me, that when I saw liberation being kind of replaced by being seen as a way to try to talk about salvation, I said, oh, that makes more sense. Because at the time, when I talk about relevance, I meant, how is Christianity relevant to a psychologically debased people, right? That it's not just the soul that was actually injured, it was actually the mind too, right? So I came up in a lot of conscientious movements about race, gender, sexuality, and that type of thing. I said, there's something not just about the soul that's off, something about the way we think in our mind that's off. So that's what took me in the path of theology as well.
Oh, that's helpful. So, before we kind of dig in to some of the questions and the big four questions that will shape the class, say a few random housekeeping things. One is on the resource page. We will keep adding the videos of each thing on there and links to download the MP3s, whichever way you want to get the content. That means you don't have to join live. If you get behind and don't want to look at the video until you've done the reading. You can do that, or you can do what I would do: watch the videos, do the reading, then you can rewatch to make sure you got what you did. That's what I tend to do whenever I get the online class things. Also, you can download and play at fast speeds. For those that have hearing impairments, make sure you hit the button on YouTube videos, and you'll get all the closed captioning pops up on YouTube. That's the best way to do that. On the resource page too, for each of the 4 deep dives, so think like 2 weeks really you have to read the reading. We have a number of different ways for you to engage the content, because Adam is very, very kind, made PDFs of a number of different articles and chapters around the big question. Also put in links to some really cool videos if you prefer to listen to a lecture or watch a documentary or stuff. If you want to just download the PDFs and look at those, then you don't have to end up purchasing whole books. For those that, basically will use any excuse to buy a book, because why not? Like, you have like the second purpose of a tree is to become a book. It's like, deal with carbon dioxide, then books. Right? I feel like that's like, if I was a tree, I'd want to be a cool book. I wouldn't want to be some like crappy book. I'd want to be something like For My People, and my video is like cutting it out, but For My People by James Cohen, Sisters in the Wilderness, Dolores Williams.
Yeah.
Those 2 texts are outlined in the you'll see which chapters we're reading each week. So but the main thing is that you can engage the different types of resources in the ways that work best for you. I know that there's a number of people in groups that are trying to connect in local areas, depending on whatever your COVID rules are, or groups that are wanting to connect to do more discussion stuff online. Any of you that are wanting to organize one of those, or are already, you can reply to the email and let me know, and I'll try to collect them all and send and share it. I know there's a couple people wanting to organize online discussion groups where you can break out in small numbers, which with 1,600 people is like almost impossible. It is impossible. We broke Zoom. I didn't know that more than 100 people would show up in the Zoom room when it was streaming. But anyway, you get what I'm saying. If you want to host a group, I know there's like a couple groups that I've already got together, like in Oklahoma, in California, in Arkansas, in North Carolina. But if you have one of those groups and want to invite others that are locals, you can let me know, and I'll share it with everybody in an email. And if you want to host one of the online groups, you can let me know that. The other thing I was going to say is each week on Tuesday, on the deep dive weeks, we'll be in the Facebook group at 5, and you'll see we'll have a lecture. Adam will give a lecture, then he and I will discuss the reading and stuff like that. And over the course of the week and after it, if you have questions and things, send them via email if they're ones like you want us to like wrestle with, like if they're like bigger questions and stuff. If they're ones you're wanting to spark conversation on, feel free to post in the group and things, and we can discuss there under the video, because that way your question it'll be easy for us to figure out what was being said when the question came up. That's really the cheating part of that. I can't think of any other real obvious boring thing I should say. What do you think, Adam? Is there something?
That sounds excellent, but you are the man with procedures here. So
I know, but you've been a part of reading groups before. There's probably something I forgot. Main thing is you can download the articles, watch the videos, and read the books. And in their 4 2-week sections, they're all around a question. Then during the deep dive for those, it'll be lecture. We'll discuss the readings, and then Q&A type thing. Then we'll have special guests that will join and interact. And we're working on getting the exact times and things. If it's a weird time, then it won't be at the normal time. But that's because I don't tell Professor Coleman or Bishop Curry when they need to do things. It's just not how it works. For those who don't know, Monica Coleman was on my dissertation committee. So, yeah. Anyway,
Right.
so this is there's your boring parts.
Mhm.
And do know, like, if you want to invite someone into the class, like, it really is, it was set as pay as what you can, because we really just want more people to wrestle with the text, right? And to meet others that are doing it, because I think there's a whole lot of people right now that are looking for a community to flesh out theologically and in the streets the deep desires that are coming up, and we're at a time we might have some genuine change in places that will be good, true, and beautiful. So in whatever way we can contribute to that, I'm fully supportive. So
They also might want to check out the Theocon discussion, because we touched on a number of these issues as well. So
oh
you
yeah,
can
yeah,
direct them to that too, the theological ethics.
yeah, yeah. I'll put links to that on the resource page. Adam and Gary Dorian did lectures on theological ethics in the current crises, and then we had a discussion, an interaction about it, which was wonderful. So yeah, I'll make sure to, I'm gonna write that down to put that in the group. Um, all right. So
A lot of material here.
yeah. So the first question someone sent in advance, and I think is a great first question to kind of frame the content, is something you mentioned, I think, in the Theocon discussion, was the that just like James Cohen saw the Black Power movement as a situation or a place to begin to think theologically, right? And not just like the Black Church initially had some resistance as to what do you do with the Black Power movement and how do we engage it. And James Cohen goes, engage it. Like we have to think theologically from it. Like, what is getting itself done in it, and how do we engage it theologically? You compare that to the possible potential of the Black Lives Matter movement. So
Yeah.
and the question was, could you unpack more about James Cohen's relationship with the Black Power movement, and then if we follow that lead, what could it look like to, as people of faith and as congregational leaders and activists, to engage the Black Lives Matter movement as a place of theological reflection?
Wow, that is an excellent question. Well, speaking from Cohen, I'll go from the origins of Black theology to contemporary. What Cohen wanted to do was really challenge the very identity of Christian faith, right? That he believed that our popular understanding and our contemporary understanding of Christian faith had been deeply corrupted. It didn't comport with biblical reality. Another way of saying this is that Christianity at the time, this is around the 1960s, and even contemporary today, understands itself as a religion of love. And love it's a personal force and also a social force. But the love ethic has been so deeply corrupted, and understanding religion exclusively as a religion of love conceals the reality of power, right? Love without the power to guarantee justice in human relations is meaningless, right? That was the case that he made. So he went back and really reread the New Testament. And what was the purpose of Jesus coming into the world, or God incarnating into the world? Well, he argued, he took this from basically 1 John 3:8, that God enters into the depths of human existence in order to eradicate evil, right? So he looked at the Black Power movement not as anti-white, anti-American, anti-Christian. He looked at the very inner heart of the Black Power movement as a way to enter into the depths to eradicate an evil that had been going unmarked within Christian theology for centuries in the United States, right? So that's where he marked that is. And he said that no, Black Power is not some type of evil twin of the civil rights movement, right? Bill Clinton made this case in, John Lewis's funeral that many of us were upset about. He talked about the legacy of Kwame Ture and posed it against the legacy of John Lewis. Those were proxies for civil rights versus Black power. Kwame Ture was a Black power person. John Lewis was a civil rights person, right? And he kind of pitted it against us. But in the Black community, we look at both as indispensable, right? So Black power is not something that was seen as something that was anti. It was seen as pro-liberation, as a movement for self-determination from the movement of the oppressed. Cohen took that idea of Black power equals liberation and Christianity equals liberation and saw it as identical and carved the theological perspective out of that. Now, it's our job to kind of see, well, what is Black Lives Matter about? What is the theological raison d'etre? What is the theological theme that's emerging from that? And what I've said before, to me, the fundamental theological challenge for Black Lives Matter is life togetherness, right? What does life together look like, right? I mean, it could be liberation. I think there's a liberative theme within it, and it's an expression of the Black liberation movement. But I think the larger goal and impact is about looking at life togetherness. And I say that by looking at how these statues are being moved, right? It contains a dangerous memory, and Metz talks about a dangerous memory that's rooted in it, that it's tapping into a dangerous memory of history, which Confederate statues are going down, Christopher Columbus, neo-colonial statues are going down around the world. And I'm saying that that's the kind of critique, but also the promise of what does it look like afterwards? How are we bonded together in a new way, in a way where white supremacy is not an active reality in the world, right? So that's where I see that is where faith should move to, trying to theologize around Black Lives Matter in a way of trying to raise that question, the question of community, the question of life togetherness. And there are different aspects of that in terms of liberation or reconciliation. I think those are moments within the larger framework of that. But that's how I see it. There are possibilities for creative transformation within the Black Lives Matter movement. And I think churches should take advantage of this Kairos moment in history to enact that.
Mm-hmm. And as someone who spends time dealing with undergrad college students and with activists in the community and in religious communities, and I've seen you doing panels and stuff trying to connect these dots. Like, do you have any suggestions for faith leaders in ways they can connect in where they are becoming allies with the movement and not commandeering things, which tends to be a tendency of everyone with a rev in front of their name? It's hard not to do that.
No, that's a great question. What I say is start from where you are, right? Not everybody has to be a protester, right? If you're not called to be a protester, that's not your thing, you could still be in solidarity with the aims and goals of the movement without actually going out and being a frontline person. And what I usually tell ministers, faith leaders that are locally around here, is let's not fall in the contradiction of celebrating the Confederate monuments being torn down when you have a white Jesus in your pulpit. That is even more dangerous than any Confederate general has ever been, right? I said, start there. Start with your own religious iconography that's been damaging and dangerous. Start with white Jesus, right? That would even be more of a victory than actually Christopher Columbus or Jefferson Davis or any of the other Confederate monuments. So I think you could start there. I also think you could try to talk about different forms of liturgy, right? You could bring people of color, you could bring it into your liturgy in terms of the literature, right? I'm not even talking about physical spaces because we're in a COVID pandemic situation. but you can mix up the literature. You could bring a James Cohen, you could bring a Martin Luther King, you could bring a Nat Turner, you could bring a Maria Stewart, you could bring people into your liturgy and read prayers from the African American experience. So I think little things like that, and small adjustments like that, could actually expand the conversation partners with your own faith. And that's where I think the first movement is to not be so homogeneous in your circle of conversation partners that inform your faith, is to expand your circle. I think start there.
I had a friend in, let's see, I think he's in Missouri or Kansas. I don't remember now, but one of them, who said that his congregation, became animated in a new way. But it's a small, predominantly older congregation. And for obviously COVID reasons, they're not wanting to go get on the streets, and most of them have never done a protest before. But they organized because they have multiple families that have giant smokers. So they started making meals for all the local activists. And then the youth group members that were already going down there, and college kids, showed up with large amounts of food.
Right. That's exactly what I'm talking
at the
about.
protest.
Yeah.
And I was
important.
like,
That's crucial. We're a network of relations, as we say. We're a network of relations. And what I also think I should add in terms of what this demands, because I've been working with a group of pastors for the last month or so this summer, is that and I find this mostly in white churches, because the black churches, this is not as much of a problem, is I think this is calling us to the prophetic edge of Christian faith, right? If you can think of Christianity as a priestly and a prophetic dimension, what Black theology enhances and what Black movements do, they call you to the prophetic, which is the social justice edge of faith. And I think that my fear is, like, this is not the first incarnation of Black Lives Matter, right? Like, Black Lives Matter started with Trayvon Martin, which is a number of years ago, right? This happened, I think, in 08 or 09, I can't even remember. But it was faddish, right? Like, after the protest died down, then church interest started dying down. And I said that we shouldn't look at this as just a political thing. This should be part of our faith mandate, a faith imperative. And the way to do that is to see this as part of the prophetic dimension of your faith, right? And read it like that. The way James Cohen talks about it in The Cross and the Lynching Tree is that we can't have a rejected, criminalized, crucified body that's at the heart of our faith and ignore rejected, crucified bodies in the streets of American society. That we have to see the two as connected, right? And I'm challenging pastors all throughout the country to put on those type of theological lenses when they look at their faith.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's really helpful. One of the challenges I think that has shown up, and there were two questions that got at it in different ways, was what do we do with the anger and resentment for those that have had an ongoing experience of racism and oppression in America? And then it's like all of a sudden a whole bunch of white people decided to notice it, right? And so, like, you simultaneously want to say, yes, we weren't lying, and why did it have to go this far? And you also don't want to resist people finally showing up and having allies and lending voice and such. And yet it's connected to real anger and violence. So, what do we do as, or not me, but as people of color experiencing anger in a moment when finally your white friends decided you weren't exaggerating?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hear a little bit of that conversation coming out of Portland, right?
Mm-hmm.
And really, it's not so much about the anger of the lack of recognition. It's more about having something that is a Black initiative being overshadowed with with white suburban agendas. about other wrongs, where it co-opts the force of the critique with other things, or it's stuffed into it. So it becomes so much that you can't focus on what the original thing was. And I think that a good ally should just point back, right? Point back to, well, we're here for this, right? We should be clear on our goals, that there may be other wrongs in the world, but we cannot use that as a substitute, right, for this racial justice goals. We're talking about issues of police violence and police murder and police brutality and like Black and other people of color, right? I think you have to commit a certain type of I get, I would, no, well, probably just to say is that you should always just be humble when you're an ally, when you're in solid, and I would say just out a freedom fighter, right? That we know that oppression is an interlocking set of numerous things, right? Oppression, just like liberation, is not an isolated thing, but we're privileging one part of that network of interlocking issues, and that's white supremacy or racial injustice. And we should also always have that at the forefront when we're trying to be an advocate.
Mm-hmm. And when you earlier, when we kind of announced the class, you said something during that interview that stuck with me. You talked about an experience of recognizing you didn't have to work against your anger, but recognize it as sacred.
Yeah.
And you know that, I mean, I guess it really depends on your relationship to your anger as to how you hear that. But like I tend to not be good at acknowledging feelings until they get to the extreme version.
Right.
And
Yeah.
then they acknowledge me, like it kind of, right.
That's
And,
right. Yeah.
and so the way that observation that you talked about, earlier, you said that, maybe the anger in you is sacred and it's an entry point for thinking about, liberation. Underneath, I think that's an observation that's true about like whatever your emotions are about reality. Like if you acknowledge them, then they can actually be like, then reality can become a place that you're engaging. But so often, and I think this is definitely true for people of privilege, are uncomfortable acknowledging the inheritance of supremacy, privilege, and stuff like that, is you learn to swallow feelings that you have about the actual impact your connections and relations and stuff have, so that you don't ever have to acknowledge it and deal with reality, right? And so
Right.
like sometimes that means maybe that experience of guilt is the beginning of liberation, not just anger or whatever it is. Maybe like if the feelings are about reality and then you deny them as a means to avoid it, then they can also be something you give permission to as a place to move towards wholeness and liberation in a deeper community.
Yeah, I would agree. Look, the way I was thinking about it, or the way it kind of came to me, is that anger is an expression of your mode of connectedness, right? You get most anger with things that you're most intimately connected with, right? So that's why so many Black folks were so angered at just police brutality, even if it never happened to them in their lives, right? Even if they never had a negative police, they're angered because they're connected to that reality. There's a certain form of intimacy with that, right? So anger is a form of caring, it's a form of compassion, right? It's an inward refusal to say, this is wrong. Things can't exist like this. And it's a sign that transformation is required. So I call anger as kind of the work of the sacred, right? And I think feminists and womanist theologians probably are more articulate about that, because they've been, probably particularly because of the gendered experience of this country, about told to be in a culture of silence. And usually that's around sexual abuse and all that type of thing. But anger is a mode of sacred work, or what Bev Harrison talks about it, anger is a work of love. And what it's really saying is a relational view of anger, not just anger as some isolated thing apart from other things that we're doing.
Mm-hmm. So What I like to do is to kind of introduce the four big themes, and um, and maybe I'll say them, and then you whet the appetite. You know,
Okay. Okay.
when we wrestle with this, here's the part you should lose sleep on and wrestle with, like uh, you know, whatever pops to your mind, uh, and I also think it'll give people a framework to think about, like the movement of the whole, of the readings and the discussion when you get to the beginning, because what we talk about first and some of the readings on African traditional religion, Christianity's relationship to Africa, and all that kind of stuff become resources as you move through to help have a more robust account and decenter the spectator account of Black theology that comes from the Eurocentric narrative. And that's why the first week's big theme is religion beyond whiteness. Is Christianity a white man's religion? And can Christianity be separated from the Western colonial empire building?
Right. Well, you know, when we look at the whole discipline of theology, there are many ways about what the way our theological questions are raised determines how our theologies are shaped, right? So when you get to Black theology and some forms of liberation theology, the question becomes, if God loves us, why do we suffer, right? If God loves us, why do we suffer so much? And that's been a prominent theological question ever since Blacks were Christianized in the United States. They're looking at it, they're talking about a God of love in the Bible, then they're looking at a wretched condition and wondering, how is that compatible? It doesn't feel like a loving God would permit this to happen, right? That became the one of the fundamental questions of theology. In Latin America, the same thing happened when they talked about, if God loves us, why are we so poor, right? Why are we so subsistent? So when you take that question deep and look at it seriously, the old rules of theology don't really apply to answer that question because it's really answered philosophically. So there's a need for new rules for theology, right? So in Black theology, the question of theodicy became to the fore, right? If God is good and if God is all good and God is all powerful, why do Black folks live so lowly and white folks live so well, right? And during the 60s, Malcolm X had a very innovative response to this answer, to this question, I mean. He said, look, the reason why you have trouble trying to reconcile a loving God with the wretched condition of Blacks is because your assumptions about the Christian God being a loving God are wrong. The Christian God is not a loving God. The Christian God is a slave-making God, a God that hinders Black liberation, right? It causes disunity among Black people, and it causes Black people to love their neighbors more than themselves, their white neighbors more than themselves. So he made the case that Christianity has no saving power for African Americans because you've been here for hundreds of years and you're still enslaved. So he wanted Black people to come out of Christianity and then go right into Islam or another type of non-Christian religion. So that became like the wrestling point. Now, Black theologians would hear that and try to wrestle with trying to make a case for why you could be Black and Christian at the same time, right? So part of what we're going to do our first week, right, is to look at how Black folks actually, how the question became such a, came to the fore during the 1960s and how Black Christian intellectuals replied and responded and addressed that question.
Mm-hmm. And I think that one way of hearing that question, especially if you are a Christian and you're part of the white church is like should we continue to talk about Christianity where our own expression is treated as normative, right? And this shows up in so many different places, right? Like, why do you why is your group at AAR called Black Theology and I'm part of Systematic Theology, right? Like there, like even the way we talk about disciplines, there's like the real one that everyone has to do for the core class. Right. You know, the 7 questions that Eurocentric theologians have asked forever, and notice none of them use the word justice or liberation. And then you have contextual theologies. And if you want, you could use that elective you get to pick in any theology, ethics, or history to do a contextual theology. And then you can be ordained, right? Like the academy does it that way. The church does it in different ways. But I think that if we're going to be honest about what is becoming clear to a growing number of people in the American church, that and Doug mentioned this in the comments when Cornel West said that the slave redeemed the religion the master corrupted in his midst. That what is Orthodox Christianity in America? It can't be the one that thinks owning people is a good idea, and that once you lose a war about it, you create new legal ways to preserve the same type of power.
Absolutely. Yeah, I'm glad you said that, because that helps even sharpen it. I mean, really the question at stake here is the question of Christian identity. Is Christianity more than the theological expression of a European worldview? Right? Is Christianity more than the theological expression of a European worldview? Because if it's not, we ought to just, hang up shop and just say, hey, this is just really just, it's not a will to truth, it's a will to power, right? So we're just doing power dynamics here. We're not really trying to figure out the truth, right? And I think this is what Black theology puts Christianity on trial here and says, can you be true to your own documents? Are you, that the accusation from Black critical thinkers is that Christianity is incarnating, it's running counter to the truth that it claims to incarnate, right? It runs counter to the truth that it claims to incarnate. Now, why is that? And what is the truth? Materially, how is that being expressed? And those are some of the questions that are being explored in the first 2 sessions, is looking at that. Is it more than this? And if it's more, what is that more? What does that more entail?
Yeah, in the second week, because we kind of lapse in it, is the second 2 weeks is wrestling with Black theology as a liberation theology. And yes, we all will recognize it is a liberation theology. And yes, it is sad that Christians have theologies that aren't liberation theologies, but I think they're called Pharaohologies. But how is Black theology a liberation theology? And in particular, in looking at its history and its text and wrestling with James Cohen, how does it generate new norms and sources for theology? So especially for those that aren't familiar, in the way an academic thinks about norms and sources for theology, how does Black theology change the way it engages with text and traditions and experience and reason and such, to have a robust theology of liberation?
Yeah, that's helpful. I mean, the way I kind of explain it to people who may be unfamiliar, to kind of riff off Bart, is that the Bible is a strange world. If you look at the Bible and it's too familiar to you, I mean, and you don't find it as strange, you're like, what? And puzzling, then you're probably not reading it right? That Christianity is not an accident, right? That Jesus was crucified and that the disciples were executed and the Christian movements were criminalized. And what Black theology seeks to do is bring that same type of dangers, that same type of subversiveness, and unlock it in contemporary terms. And that's where Blackness becomes an analogy, right? It can be mean as literally Black people or Black community, but it's also an analogical way of trying to unlock, right? So certain types of truth within the Christian gospel, a truth that unsettles, not calm, but unsettles, a truth that's dangerous, right? That the Christianity is a story about a God who liberates an oppressed Hebrew nation, incarnates into an oppressed Jew, and unleashes her liberating power into the oppressed of today, right? That's a dangerous truth that Black theology tries to unlock.
Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a trajectory in the class that it's lined kind of historically, so that as you in the first week, in a sense, it's looking back to what's the origin story of Christianity in Africa, of Black theology, and in the second week there's the formative experience of where Black theology gains its own voice and recognition within the church and in the academy, and within the movement for in the Black Power movement and such like that. And in the third week, the question revolves around gendering Blackness, and there we engage womanist theology, and also the way the LGBTQ question has shown up in the life of the Black church and Black theology, and in the womanist story, Dolores Williams focuses on the figure of Hagar in the Hebrew Bible, the first person to name God from their experience with the divine, and it's it's not Sarah, and also the critique of the cross as the central image for understanding the gospel, and her kind of turn towards the ministry of Jesus, and how the Western church, right? Like you got how Jesus was conceived in the creed, you got that he died and then he rose again, but you forgot like all the stuff he did. And what if we turned and paid more attention to that? So when you look at those questions around the womanist and LGBTQ, those conversations bring to Black theology, how would you kind of like set up engaging there?
Yeah, well, Black theology as a whole gives interpretive priority to people on the margins of social power. When you get womanist critique, the womanist movement comes out of two things. One source is Black freedom movement, mostly the civil rights and Black power movement. And it's a critique of the sexism, that they're too androcentric in the way they talked about Black communities. So Black always was identical with Black male, right? The Black male was normative. And Black women's issues were either marginalized or silenced. And you also had Black women who were in the feminist movement, right? And feminism was seen as all woman, but they ignored Black women, right? So it's a critique of the sexism of the Black freedom movement and the racism of the white feminist movement. And there's a whole kind of epistemic way of knowing from the standpoint as I am a Black woman. And how do you interpret Christian narratives in light of the history of Black women specifically, the host of issues, narrative, sensibilities, and Christianity looks differently from there. So one of the major paradigmatic shifts as it relates to Black theology is that the Exodus story that is so prominent within Black theology gets shifted to the story of Hagar in the wilderness. That is more structurally similar to the story of Black women, of wandering in the wilderness, and not the idea of there's some type of liberation at the end of this story, as with the Exodus story, but the idea that she's in the wilderness, and it's not that God actually liberates her, that she survives out her own wit and she has a higher quality of life, right? So that's the way womanist theology starts to unfold, is looking at Christian Faith from a story, from the standpoint of I am a Black woman and Black women's experience with specificity.
And how is the for especially for people that have wrestled with the sexuality question in it's even different, right, in mainline congregations than evangelical ones, but is there a particular way the sexuality question gets framed differently in the Black church? And thinking of we have a number of readings, and I've found, like, when I read it, I realized I could have known what those theologians said, but not known their experience of like the context from which they speak out of. Because I've hung out in evangelical churches and mainline Protestant churches that are culturally white, regardless of how diverse the congregation is.
Right. Yeah. Thank you for asking that second part of the question. Yeah, it is different in the Black church because Black bodies are demonized, right? Christianity is kind of a body denying faith as it's properly understood, and not very inclusive about sex in general, right? But on top of that, if you've had your body be demonized, right, that you have a double stigma. You have the stigma of sexuality, you have the stigmas of Black bodies and the way they've been actually associated with sex. So, and the reason why I'm putting this as framing it that way is because the conversation of sex is even more difficult in many Black spaces because of the demonization of Blackness and the demon of sexuality. So any type of non-conforming sexuality, right, is seen as something that doesn't comport with the politics of respectability, right? So there's been a very harsh reaction to non-conforming sexualities in the Black community. And the only way really to kind of get at this within Black congregation is really to address the biblical text, right? So Kelly Brown Douglas says like this: just like with most white churches, most Black churches have a hard time being gender and sexually inclusive. And they usually, there's a kind of this very literalistic appeal to scripture. So Kelly Brown Douglas raises this question. She says, why is it that you have so many scriptures that are pro-slavery and we don't see those as authoritative, but yet we're able to maintain all the anti-homosexual things as authoritative, right? So she talks about a hermeneutics of liberation that actually looks at these texts of terror, right, that actually talk about pro-slavery, and Black people opt for a more authoritative source within the text, and she applies that to homophobic texts within the scriptural text. And then she raises the question, what is sinful? Is homophobia sinful, or is homosexuality sinful, right? What is more life-denying? And works it out through that. So that's what we'll talk about.
Yeah, and I think one part of that's important to recognize is that is one of the first questions that a lot of Christians recognize, that hermeneutics is necessary, right? The art of interpretation, hermeneutics. And that instilled in hermeneutics, even though you may not have thought about it and consciously kind of downloaded the software to interpret the scriptures in the world and your experience through some particular hermeneutic, it's happened. It's a normal part of being born in the world. You're thrown in the world. You don't pick the place, the family, the situation, any of it. And yet, while you learn to speak and learn to move and eat and get dressed and walk in the world, you've learned a way of interpreting it. And sometimes when you have this text you call authoritative and your lived experience conflict, you have to acknowledge the fact that you do interpret, right? And the thing is, you're always doing it. It's just sometimes sexuality becomes one of those places that if you pride yourself in being biblical, you realize you have to acknowledge, no, there was actually power being exercised in my biblical commitment, and there was someone's power. So whose was it, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And the
Yeah.
white church has to recognize there was a white supremacist power exercised when it sang hymns and when it read scripture, such that until you saw someone murdered on a screen, you didn't think you could say Black Lives Matter in public and keep your job.
Right.
And you thought Colin Kaepernick was distracting you from your fantasy football game and all this kind of stuff, right? There was a hermeneutic there. So like when you are reading any of these questions, like for people of privilege, you have to recognize that your consciousness has been occupied by something and it ain't all holy. So hermeneutics is one of the places that power resides. And that's why I think it makes sense that the last 2 weeks, the focus is on the Black Christ, understanding God from the underside of empire. And the question is one that is a familiar one if you're a theologian, right? Who is Christ for us today? And the particular framework in which you set it up is through James Cohen's Cross and the Lynching Tree and the connection between those two types of violence.
Right. Yeah.
And I just think that especially for those that have maybe seen the Bill Moyers interview with James Cohen, or seen, I know, like Otis Moss III's sermon, right? Like recently blew up on the internet. And he also loves comic books. Did you know that? That's a complete aside. I've
heard. Yeah.
Brian McLaren the other day was like, I said something about a comic book as an example, and he was like, you know, the only other person that gives me comic book examples like I read them, Otis Moss. So be like, anyway, but I think that there's I think it makes sense to end there, because what initiated the Black Lives Matter movement and what's reinvigorated it is the ability for America to continue to justify a logic of lynching.
Right. Absolutely. We also should talk a bit about the metaphors, right? Of blackness and whiteness, because some people have trouble with that. And you know, within Black theology, there's different understandings. I mean, we're going to talk about what does blackness actually mean, right? Is it skin color alone? What is whiteness? Is it skin color alone? And for some theologians, that's what they're talking about. When they talk about Black Jesus, they're talking about the historical Jesus was physiologically Black or phenotypically Black. But with James Cohen, he tends to use blackness and whiteness more analogical. And this analogical idea goes back to Aquinas, and David Tracy wrote a whole book on the analogical imagination. And what means blackness is an analogy, meaning blackness in the North American context, because Cohen always prefaced this by, I'm talking about the way blackness functions in the North American matrix. It means bottom, right? It's been criminalized. It means poverty, right? When you think of Black communities, all those images of that. So he's trying to really play with the way blackness has been denigrated as suffering in the context of the United States, while whiteness has been seen as transparent, unmarked, but whiteness connects Christian faith to hierarchies of power and privilege, which he argues corrupts biblical reality, right? So what's happening here in terms of Christology is that when he talks about a Black Christ, he's making an analogy is blackness is the bottom of American society, like Christ was the bottom of Roman society, right? So blackness is an interpretive key for unlocking a biblical truth, a truth of power, a truth of danger, a truth of subversiveness, that Jesus didn't die of natural causes, right? Jesus died as a criminal, the way Black people die as criminals. Jesus was a minority, the way Black people are minority. Jesus was anti-imperial, the way Black people are positioned anti-imperial, purely in the United States. So he's looking at structural analogies and really trying to make the gospel come to life, a gospel that's unsettling, a gospel that disturbs and disrupts the same way it did in the first century.
Yeah, definitely. Like it is a it well, and I would put it this way, like when you ask the question, who is Christ for us today?
Mm-hmm.
And then the next moment is to use your analogical imagination to ask, who bears the cross today?
Mm-hmm.
Then you've started to ask the question in a liberative way, right? Where liberation's a real outcome. But if you ask, like, where is Christ today? And you don't concern yourself with the bloody bench of human history and injustice, then you're not just ignoring the suffering and violence at present. You're ignoring the very reason Jesus died, right? Like the New Testament, the Gospels describe Jesus' proclamation and instantiation of the kingdom of God as arriving at odds with the world as it is, right? In the Gospel of John, it says he came to his own and they knew him not, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then in the Synoptic Gospels, the kingdom of God is set right up against the kingdom of Caesar. And so the idea that you could have a robust affirmation, you could say Jesus is Lord without crossing your fingers and not have conflict with the principalities and powers that be, is funny. It's just normative. But remember, right, like we are American Christians, and like we had like it's just I don't understand, like
It's been domesticated. You're
right.
really talking about how faith has been so domesticated and it happens almost undetectable. It's almost been undetectable that you think what you're doing is you're actually worshiping the Christ of biblical reality, but what you're really doing is really you're following the God of American empire instead of the God of Jesus Christ, right? Where the nerve center of our consent, to use a Howard Thurman term, is really more wedded to power, prestige, and wealth than the liberating gospel of the God of Jesus Christ, right? So that makes it a form of idolatry. So most of American Christianity is really a celebration and a liturgy of idolatry rather than following a crucified God, right? A crucified God is something that leads us in a different direction, that takes the narrow way, not the broad way, and is deeply unsettling. If you've never been unsettled, unhoused, right, in your faith, you probably aren't really getting presented with the right faith.
Mm-hmm.
If it's too culturally comfortable for you to do this, then you probably haven't heard it the right way. And Black theology comes in and tries to make an intervention and disrupt the God of American empire from the God of Jesus Christ, and talks about a new soteriology so that Christianity is a will to truth instead of a will to power.
Mm-hmm. It and do you think to me, and I know Cohen brings this up, and so we'll probably talk about it a little bit later, but I think a lot of Protestants made Christianity more cognitive. It made it more centered on the doctrines you assent to, right? Because the assent to an authority in the Catholic Church, the experience of the early Protestants was that actually led to oppressive material outcomes, right? And Luther's a great example of it, right? But so the theology was always connected to your material lived existence. And so Luther's critique was also on behalf of affirming a deep affirmation of God for all vocations, all lived experience, and these type of things, as well as other nerdy theological reasons. And yet the fruits of Protestantism, when it encountered because it emerges the same time capitalism emerges, is this narrowing of interest. We got more in our heads religiously, and became more, we became to define ourselves as branches by our thoughts, and then our interpretations of practices, right? Like, and I think that move has led people to be utterly defensive when you lack certainty about particular commitments, and utterly blind to the consequences of what the institutions who are begging for your commitment do to bodies. And it's not like Black theology is a fun place to wrestle with that, because here's what you'll discover at James Cohen. He's only half interested in convincing a white theologian he's right, but he also wants you to know he's smarter than you, right? Like, he does both at the same time. And so like, he does these like kung fu moves, like where the attacker's being aggressive, and instead of like fighting back, you just grab it and then pull them to the ground, right? And so he does this one move in our reading in, I think, week 2, where he basically says, you like Martin Luther, you like what he was doing, like, you're a Protestant, you like Karl Barth, like, you don't like Nazis, right? And he uses both of them, the way that the word of God intervenes into the world as it is, the world you understand, and breaks it. And then he goes,
absolutely.
Well, I know this isn't crazy, because you obviously believe the image of God resides in all humans, but what if it actually resided in all humans and you meant it, and you lived in America in the Jim Crow South? Like, what do you think about that?
Absolutely.
Right.
Why is it?
And what would intervention look like? And it's like when I had a friend say one time, literally and not lying, said, well, I would act like Jesus, but my doctrine's in the way. And and I don't think he realized just how straightforward it was.
Right.
It's like that recent Trump interview on HBO, where you just like, admit to it. But I do think there is this challenge of breaking through the protective covering your ideas give you. Because if certainty is your ideas, then you're real protective of the blanket, and not like the lived reality underneath it. And that could be problematic.
No, you hit on a number of great points, and what you're reminded me to actually state explicitly is that Black theology is a paradigm change, right? We're moving from orthodoxy to orthopraxis, to use a big word, right? Which is about not so much about belief, but about the practice of faith. Mm-hmm. That's the acid test. Who is your faith accountable for? Right? Is it just some form of cognition that you actually, the more intensity you believe in something, the more the fruits of faith are going to happen? Or is it the practice or the way of life, right? And Black theology goes back to the kind of acts way. It's the way, right? It's a procedure. And then it's really coming to counter with, why has Christianity been so paralyzed in light of the color bar, right? Like, how has a religion premised on neighborly love been so ineffective in light of the color bar, right? And there's got to be something wrong with that, with the way, not just with the way people believe, but the way people practice. That if you don't practice right, you don't believe right. That's the assumption of James Cohen. So he really tries to give a new theological paradigm. It's not just tinkering at the edges. It's a completely different way of conceiving of what Christian identity is. So it's a way of reordering and reframing Christian faith toward the aim and goal of liberation, right? To talk about Christianity, to have Christianity not run from the truth it claims to encounter, right? Like it claims to incarnate a God of love and justice, yet it runs counter to that, right? Well, Black theology wants to say, if this is what you're claiming, that God embodies love and justice, what does that mean in a racially divided world? And who does God side with in that? Well, he sides not so much Black against white, but right against wrong, right, in the context, and then lures people by aims of discipleship into that struggle of right against wrong,
Yep.
right? What does that look like in the context of racialized oppression? And that's what the Project of Black Theology is attempting to do.
So I'm gonna pull this up real quick. That reminds me of something. My friend Jenny, she's a Methodist minister and is in the group, and invited her congregants, not all of them, the ones that she didn't think she'd get in too much trouble for inviting, hoping to create an enclave of more determined resistance in the Deep South Methodist congregation. Note to self, change the name on the released version of this. Obviously, her name's really not Jenny. It's something else. And said, how would you describe, why would you describe this task of wrestling with these texts as necessary? And I said, and this is what I wrote to her. I said, if someone wants to ask who we are as a church, it is better to ask the crucified people. And white Christianity has been the handmaiden of white supremacy in our nation state. And if we would like to be bearers of the gospel, then we have to be honest about reality. We can't lie. Where reality is a scandal, there is concealment. The anxiety around saying Black Lives Matter just reveals that the crucified people are indeed the truth tellers of reality, and those that can't bear reality cannot accept the fullness of the gospel. Reality includes the revelation of idols, and those idols are revealed in the presence of reality. The reality born in the testimony of the crucified people. When we say their names, we say reality is the place in which the gospel must come. Much more perverse are the idols of the cultured and the privileged. They too demand victims in order to thrive. But with market ingenuity, the crucified people, the lynched people are concealed. And so wrestling with these texts as an uncomfortable Southern white congregation is an invitation to take Jesus as your ally again and again. There are not just wounded individuals, but crucified peoples and a tortured planet. Mercy demands more than aid, but transformation. In fact, acts of mercy alone from those with power and a place in the cross-building institutions is in fact the maintenance of systems and structures of evil. It's uncomfortable to say that. I feel condemned myself, and yet it is the church job to do this reality. Insofar as the church can become a truth-telling community, it has the possibility of becoming a collective invested in the coming kingdom of God. Doing so comes with a promise, namely, for those who benefit from the concealment of reality and a denial of our complicity, for those who find their deepest security and identity in the present order, as perverse as it may be, a proclamation of the reality must be denied, relativized, or silenced. A love of a false God comes with an appetite for fake news.
Wow, that was a heck of a long text trip.
I wrote it because she was talking about like emailing the people, like how would you do it? And then, sometimes someone asks you something and then it triggers and then you apologize that you just like told them everything you were thinking. But
right. They want you to turn on a light. So you tell them about how to make electricity, right?
Yeah. but yeah. So that was like, to me, that's me trying to capture not just like personally or as an academic engaging these texts, but as a Christian who's wants the church to be worthy of the love I give it.
No, you're absolutely right. But when I'm dealing with people who, especially evangelicals, I just say, look at the Bible, especially with Cohen. Not all Black theologians are as Bible-centered as he is, but he's very Bible-centered. Look at Luke 4:19, right? The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, right? Why, right? That's the fire of the Spirit is upon me, right? Well, to preach good news to the poor, right? To liberate the captives, to give sight to the blind and to release the oppressed, right? Like, so you have the fire of the Spirit and you have the focus on liberation, right? And to me, what happens is that some churches are good with the fire, some churches are good with the focus, but a whole church will do both. They'll connect the fire and the focus together. And to me, that's what Black theology is trying to do, is have the fire and the focus. And what does that mean for today in a racially stratified world, right? That is the simple thing what Black theology is trying to do, is unpack that passage and see what does that mean in a racially divided world.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So we only got 6 minutes left. And one of the questions that came in early, and this is in reference to your talk you gave years ago that was on the podcast about race and the third rail of as a third rail topic in religion. And and in it you made a connection between you were contrasting the radical king and the domesticated king, Martin Luther King Jr. And how in Memphis, when he goes to join the labor protest, where like I can't remember what exactly the signs were, that like
I am a man.
I'm a man.
Yeah, they're garbage workers, sanitation workers, yes.
And you drew there, and you know, this is early in the Black Lives Matter movement, like connection between that moment and in Martin Luther King's life and the current Black Lives Matter movement. And you or at least the questioner said that in an offhand comment, Adam says the MLK had penned a sermon that we don't know if he actually preached, called "America May Go to Hell."
Yeah, that's true. Yeah.
And you know, and initially I wanted to call the class "God Damned America" in honor of Jeremiah Wright, and like the subcolon being like Black theology as American Christianity salvation. And I got talked down off that ledge. But
not by me.
But no, I will like I will like make multiple versions of different things and like send to people like which one you stick with, and one of my friends messaged Becky. He's like, "Would you want me to sign up for the class, or do you want me to share it with a bunch of people that really need to read the class?" I was like, "All right, so maybe I won't put God Damned America." Right. Black theology is American Christianity's salvation story, but nonetheless, they said if you think about that legacy and not wanting the domesticated king legacy to reign, but the one who pins the sermon "America May Go to Hell," like what are the questions that he was internalizing around race and class and things like that that we could kind of carry with us? Like what was going on in that moment where he was silenced?
Yeah, just to give full context, Martin Luther King was killed April 4th, 1968. I think that was either a Tuesday or a Wednesday, and he was scheduled to preach that Sunday. And he was kind of working on a sermon, and what we have is the outline of that sermon that was titled "America May Go to Hell." And there was and he was using an analogy, and you know, the basic gist of the sermon was, if America does not treat its poor better, right, it may go to hell. And I think it's similar to Matthew 25, where you have the only place in the Bible that gives a criteria for the kingdom of God, right? Like in terms of that. And it's all related to the least of these, how you treat the least of these. This is a similar thing that King was really talking about. And the may is important because he wanted to say that America has a decision to make, right? A collective. And this is actually at the time when you're having like a war on poverty at the same time. And you also have a Vietnam War. And what he's seeing there is that the resources that were supposed to go to the war on poverty are going overseas to kill Vietnamese people who did nothing to American citizens, right? And he gives a whole, this is at the time where he gives this whole speech about how resources to really have America flourish are being diverted to this needless, useless war. So the sense of that sermon was really trying to talk to the decision makers about making a different choice. Remember that his organization, SCLC, right, which actually John Lewis was a part of before he went to SNCC, the mission of it was to redeem the soul of America, right? It was a struggle for America's soul, that America had a noble soul and a noble commitment, but she's choosing, right, to actually not honor that legacy. And what they saw the King movement was designed to do was to actually have America actually choose her higher calling, right? And really that was in combination with the declaration, the values of the Declaration of Independence, and with biblical understanding as well. So that's what he was there. And even though he was, his lieutenants didn't want him to actually be in solidarity with the workers because he was planning another march on Washington. That's why he was in solidarity, because he thought he'd be out of integrity if he didn't actually address the injustice. And just a quick addendum, what happened was there were sanitation workers in Memphis, Tennessee, who were not allowed to sleep in a hotel during a vicious storm because they were Negroes, right? They excluded. So they had to sleep outside in their equipment. And they were sleeping in the bulldozers. I guess they were using their trash compactors or something like that. One accidentally falls in and dies in his own equipment. And that's why the idea is, I am a man, I am a somebody, I shouldn't be left to die outside. And that's where the kind of the mobilization was around. It was around trying to desegregate Memphis, Tennessee, right? And to really talk about Black life mattering equal to whites, right? It's funny because people talk about Black lives mattering as if it's a comment about mattering more than. No, it's Black lives matter too, right? Because if you're white, you don't have to worry about actually not going to the hotel, right? So it's Black lives matters too, just like in terms of God bless America, not Black lives bless America, period, but God bless America and everybody else, right? So this gets back to what Tripp talks about interpretation or hermeneutics. It's about how you will interpret certain statements. And the Black community is pretty much understood that when you talk about Black Lives Matter, it's not some type of chauvinistic hegemonic statement. It's actually a way of trying to talk about parity and equality, not dominance. But in some realms, interpretive communities, that gets seen as some type of anti-white statement, which is hard for someone who grows up in the African-American community to interpret that way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I'm very excited you agreed to do this, and I'm very much looking forward to it. I'm thrilled with how many people have already joined up, and you're more than welcome to invite your friends. Someone messaged in saying like, I feel like I just went to a revival. Are you going to close in prayer? I'm as a Baptist preacher, it's very easy for me to do that, and I've discovered in certain circumstances that while I feel it makes perfect sense, it's not always a welcome experience for those with less positive relationships to the church. So I'm not going to, but do know, like, I think reading these texts and facilitating things like this it's part of I see myself vocation as a Christian theologian, and especially as someone that wants to hand off a more beautiful faith to my children and their generation, and to part of my fidelity as someone that baptizes and serves communion. I think it's necessary for us to do this. So I'll be praying throughout this process for each of you and all the people you're connected to. But I'm not going to use a streaming mic to coerce it, even if that would have been my natural MO under Southern Baptist preacher's kit motive. But I will say that if this is your first time being in a group where you know you're wrestling with questions that are difficult, be it that you're someone that's not asked all these questions, you're wrestling with it before, or as I got an email earlier today from a friend from high school who signed up, and he was like, I stopped being a Christian a long time ago. Clearly, James Cohen never came to my church. And where finding out as an African American that the Black church has this type of voice in it, and that there's a different expression than his was primarily kind of like the wealth and health style prosperity interpretation, and which again asks the relevancy question that you were bringing up earlier. Like, or either way, like if this is a lot of new stuff, like it's important to pay attention to yourself while you're reading the text too, because a good theological text, and the reason why Adam and I take it as part of our spiritual practice to wrestle with our faith and think things, is because in the practice of reading and wrestling with questions, like that's the very place that the divine comes up. My favorite picture, or one of my favorite pictures in art, is Rembrandt's Jacob wrestling with the angel. And it was something I got from Phyllis Tribble, who was at Union when Adam was there, Hebrew Bible scholar, one of feminist rhetorical criticism. She's like the pioneer scholar in it. And she said that when Jacob got done wrestling with God, he was given a new name and a permanent limp. So that's when you know you've done it well. And so my challenge for us all, as we read these texts and wrestle together in our present moment, seeking to invite this present moment as a place for theological reflection, that we are blessed with a new limp and a new name. And I think it's a possibility. And so I really deeply appreciate you giving your wisdom and time, Adam.
I'm looking forward to this. It's very exciting, and that story that you told makes me think of how King, one of his famous speeches, he raises a question: are we sleeping through a revolution? And he tells a thing about a person falls asleep, and King George is president, or is king. George is king, and then George Washington becomes president, right? When he wakes up from 100 years sleep, right? And the point we want to kind of make now is that we might be in a revolutionary moment right now, right? And we don't want to remain asleep through this revolution. And we want to capitalize and make the most out of this moment. And part of this class is going to challenge us to kind of adjust our faith in the way that we can hear the voice as God speaks to us in our contemporary moment. And we're going to do this in dialogue with traditional texts, contemporary texts, and with the conversation. And hopefully we'll challenge and push each other to be transformative agents in this world today.
All right. So we will see you on the internet, and we will see you next Tuesday at 5 o'clock Eastern time, 10 o'clock here in Scotland. And until then, enjoy the reading and send your questions.
All right.